very much. It's a little difficult for someone to be asked to give concluding remarks when you haven't had a chance actually to attend the conference that has preceded it, because you worry that you might repeat a lot of what has been said during the course of the conference. And so in order to try to avoid falling into that trap, I thought I might try to put the discussion of Guantanamo into historical perspective. And perhaps I'd even go beyond historical perspective by starting by commenting on an event that took place a few weeks ago when the government of China reopened the Chinese National Museum in Tiananmen Square, which had been closed for many years. Supposedly, this is the largest museum in the world, and it is intended to be a comprehensive museum chronicling Chinese history and a Chinese culture. But apparently a couple of things have been left out of this vast collection. In the late 1950s and in the early 1960s, there was a period in China known as the Great Leap Forward, and Mao's policies of that period had rather disastrous consequences. We now believe that more than 30 million people died in the famine that resulted from Mao's policies. While the famine was underway, cadres around the country were conforming to Mao's policies by reporting that there were record yields of crops, and so it took Beijing a long time to find out that the famine was actually underway. And of course, once they did realize it was underway, they couldn't call for international assistance because that would have been embarrassing. And so more than 30 million people were allowed to die from starvation during that period. But that was left out of the Chinese National Museum. Also left out was the decade-long Cultural Revolution, which took place from 1966 to 1976 and only ended on Mao's death. And that was a period of great persecution for Chinese. In the United States, we have not obliterated our recollection of things that have caused harm to the population in the way in which China has done. But there is, I think, very little consciousness in the United States of the history of violations of rights, violations of civil liberties. And I think it's worth pointing out in any discussion of Guantanamo that this has been a repeated phenomenon in American history. That is, it hasn't had the same contours as Guantanamo. In each case, the violation of civil liberties has been different. But every time that the United States has felt threatened from foreign sources, it has reacted in ways that have very seriously violated civil liberties. To think of the past century, one could go back to the period of 1917 to 1919. This was the period in which the United States entered World War I, the period in which the Soviet Revolution was successful in Russia, the period in the immediate aftermath of World War I of a series of anarchist bombings. During that period of 1917 to 1919, there were some 1,900 federal prosecutions for speech in the United States. And large numbers went to prison for long periods for very innocent public statements. One famous case involved a man in Minnesota who observed a group of women who were knitting socks for the soldiers fighting during World War I. And he said, no soldier will ever see these socks. And for that remark, he spent 5 years in a federal prison. In addition to the federal prosecutions, there were a very large number of state prosecutions for speech, but no one has ever done, as far as I know, a good count of the state prosecutions. This was also, of course, the period for the Palmer raids, in which many thousands of aliens were rounded up and summarily jailed without due process, and several hundred of them were deported by being put on ships that sailed for Russia and for other countries. A more familiar story, of course, is what happened during World War II, when more than 110,000 Japanese Americans were rounded up and interned. In fact, there was no case that involved sabotage or espionage by Japanese Americans. And we now know, much more about what took place during that period than was known at the time. There had been reports by people living on the West Coast that Japanese Americans were flashing signals at night, supposedly, to boats off the shore. The FBI investigated that report, and it did find that in a number of cases, Japanese Americans actually living on the coast were relatively poor people, and they used outhouses. And at night, they used flashlights in order to go to the outhouses. And that was the reason that people had observed flashing lights at the coast. But that FBI testimony was not provided to the courts in the case in which the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the internment of the Japanese Americans solely on the grounds of race. And of course, this involved Japanese American citizens, Japanese Americans who had been born in the United States, who had lived in the United States for generations. All of them, by reason of race, were excluded from the West Coast and then interned. And of course, in the aftermath of World War II, with the onset of the Cold War, we had the McCarthy period, the period of the congressional investigations of people for their associations, for their legal associations, and several 100,000 people lost jobs as a consequence of the investigations that took place in the McCarthy period. The next time we had something of this sort was during the Vietnam War period, particularly during the period that Richard Nixon was President of the United States. We tend to think of Nixon's violations of civil liberties by the shorthand of Watergate, but they went very far beyond Watergate. It included an enormous increase in federal political surveillance, in the use of wiretapping against journalists and many others, in the use of federal grand juries as a means of harassing and jailing dissenters. It included an episode that I recall very well, in which the United States Department of Justice took over the responsibility for the policing of Washington, D.C. This happened in May 1971, and William Rehnquist, an Assistant Attorney General of the United States, called it qualified martial law. And some 15,000 people were arrested during the course of a single day while they were engaged in peaceful demonstrations against the war. They couldn't accommodate them at the various police detention facilities, so they were actually taken to Robert F. Kennedy Memorial Stadium, and that was used as the detention facility. I had the satisfaction a number of years later in the ACLU in obtaining damages for a significant number of the people who were jailed during the course of that day. But the violation of civil liberties, which was a response to the anti-war demonstrations of that period, was pretty pervasive in the United States. So Guantanamo is one of a series of responses that have taken place in the United States to what are perceived as foreign threats, and in fact often have been genuine foreign threats. But what has not taken place in the course of any of these episodes up to now has been an actual direct benefit that the United States has obtained from the violation of civil liberties in actually coping or dealing with the foreign threat. It didn't happen during World War I, it didn't happen during World War II, it didn't happen during the McCarthy period, it didn't happen during the anti-Vietnam War period, and in my view, it has not happened in the current period. I think the effort to make sure that Guantanamo does not get erased from American memory is really critical. That in China, obliterating history has an incredible distorting effect upon society. Again, in the United States, we don't have a comparable record of obliterating history, but it is still the case that we tend to forget how readily we have responded to genuine and perceived foreign threats by abandoning our commitment to civil liberties and making sure that this particular attack on civil liberties is remembered seems to me an immensely important undertaking. Thank you very much.